For years, my little slice of heaven sat quietly at the edge of a sleepy suburban town. 40 acres of green hills, fenced pasture, and a winding gravel road that led nowhere but home. My grandparents had bought it long before the area ever had paved streets or manicured lawns. Back then, it was farmland surrounded by forest, the kind of place you could sit on a porch and not hear a single car for hours. When they passed it down to me, I swore I'd keep it the same. Simple, peaceful, and untouched by the creeping sprawl of modern suburbia. But as the years went on, that sprawl got closer. Developers moved in, tearing up the old oaks to build shiny new communities. It started with a few houses. Then came the mailboxes, the streetlights, the community park, and before long, a full-blown homeowners association, an HOA, had staked its claim just across my southern fence line. At first I didn't care. I kept to my land. They kept to theirs. I even waved at a few of them when they drove by. But slowly, that friendliness began to sour. It started with letters. Friendly notices, they called them. One said my fence wasn't aesthetically consistent with neighborhood standards. Another suggested I should consider repainting my barn to match the neutral tones of the surrounding community. I ignored them. My property wasn't part of their HOA, and they had no say over it. But the letters didn't stop. In fact, they got bolder. Then one day, I got a call from the county assessor's office saying my land records were being reviewed due to possible boundary updates. That phrase sent a chill down my spine. When I looked into it, I discovered something shocking. The HOA had submitted new development maps that showed part of my land, nearly 10 acres, within their planned community expansion. They called it Phase 2, as if they already owned it. I tried contacting the HOA president, a woman named Karen Holloway, to clear things up. She never took my calls. A few weeks later, I returned from a trip to find fresh survey markers, concrete foundations being poured, and construction crews swarming over my southern field. 9 houses, modern, identical, gray and white boxes, were going up. On my land, my heart sank, then burned with rage. I called the county, the sheriff, even a lawyer. Each one gave me the same baffled answer. According to the new development plans, the land did appear to belong to the HOA. Somehow, paperwork had been updated. My title deed, though still valid, was being contested. I felt powerless, watching my quiet pasture turn into a construction site. Karen, the HOA president, strutted around the site like she owned the place. The workers called her Ms. Holloway, and she barked orders with a smug certainty that made my blood boil. Every morning, I'd wake to the sound of hammers and saws, watching my land disappear beneath concrete. It was like watching someone steal your home in broad daylight while the world turned a blind eye. But I wasn't about to give up. I started digging, through property records, county archives, and every zoning law I could find. It took weeks, but eventually I discovered the key. A clerical error in the county's system had left the southern boundary line unverified for years. Karen had seen that gap and seized it, filing a fraudulent claim that absorbed those 10 acres into the HOA's jurisdiction. She thought I wouldn't notice until it was too late. She thought I'd cave, maybe even sell the rest of my land out of frustration. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. As the walls of those 9 houses rose, so did my resolve. I wasn't just going to fight for my land. I was going to make sure they paid for every inch of it. And when the last roof went up, and the "for sale" signs appeared, I knew the time had come to act. The HOA thought they'd built their perfect little extension, but they'd actually built a trap for themselves. Because those 9 houses? They weren't sitting in their neighborhood anymore. They were sitting in mine, and I was about to make them regret every nail they'd hammered into my soil. When I realized the HOA had built 9 houses on my land, shock gave way to pure determination. The land that had been my family's pride for generations was now buried under driveways, picket fences, and cookie-cutter homes, each one standing as a monument to Karen Holloway's arrogance. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not now, not ever. I started my fight the old-fashioned way. Paperwork. I pulled every document I had. the original title deed, the survey maps from the 1970s, and my property tax records. They all matched, all clearly showing that the 10 acres in question belonged to me. Then I went to the county registrar's office and requested the development maps that Karen had filed for the HOA's expansion. That's when I saw the fraud in black and white. Somehow the plat map had been redrawn, with my southern boundary line quietly shifted northward. It wasn't just an error, it was deliberate forgery. Someone had replaced the original survey data with an altered copy, and whoever did it had access to the county's digital records system. It didn't take a detective to figure out who was behind it. Karen was well connected. She used to work in real estate before becoming HOA president, and she had friends in the zoning board. She knew exactly how to bend the system to her will, so I hired an attorney, a tough, seasoned man who'd handled land disputes before. The moment he saw the paperwork, he told me I had a rock-solid case. But there was a catch. Legal battles over property can drag on for years, and Karen had already sold several of the homes to new buyers. If I pushed too hard, I could be facing not just the HOA, but 9 families who thought they were innocent homeowners. That was the part that stung most. Those people didn't know their dream homes were sitting on stolen land. They were victims too, though they didn't realize it yet. Still, I pressed forward. We filed a formal claim against the HOA and a notice of property encroachment with the county court. Almost immediately, the HOA's lawyers responded, aggressive, dismissive, and filled with legal jargon meant to intimidate. They argued that I had abandoned the southern field, that it had been unused and maintained by the HOA for years. They even tried to claim adverse possession, a legal loophole that allows someone to claim ownership of land they've used openly and continuously for a certain period. But their argument fell apart when my attorney presented proof that I'd been paying taxes on that land every single year. Taxes the HOA had never contributed to. It was like watching a house of cards crumble. As the case gained momentum, local news picked up the story. The headline read, "Homeowners discover their houses built on disputed land." Cameras started showing up outside the gates of the HOA community. Karen tried to control the narrative, painting me as a greedy landowner trying to extort the neighborhood. But her smug composure began to crack when the truth started surfacing. One by one, homeowners came forward with complaints. Their closing documents didn't match the official property lines. Their addresses weren't appearing in the county database correctly. Some of them even discovered that their mortgage lenders had flagged irregularities. The chaos spread through the community like wildfire. Meanwhile, my lawyer filed for an injunction, halting any further sales or construction on the disputed land until ownership was resolved. That single move froze everything. Karen's grand Phase 2 expansion was dead in the water. But here's where it got even more interesting. When we dug deeper, we found that Karen hadn't just overstepped her authority. She'd personally profited from the deal. She'd used her position as HOA president to approve her own development company as the contractor, funneling thousands in management fees into her pocket. The fraud wasn't just about land theft anymore. It was about corruption, embezzlement, and abuse of power. The pressure mounted fast. The HOA board, once loyal to Karen, began turning against her. Homeowners demanded answers. The county launched an internal investigation into how the fraudulent maps were approved in the first place. And while all this was happening, my lawyer and I were quietly preparing our next move. A lawsuit seeking full ownership acknowledgement, damages for trespassing, and a retroactive rental fee for every month those 9 houses had been standing on my land. The court case was brutal. Karen tried everything: counterclaims, emotional appeals, even dragging my late grandparents' ownership records into question. But evidence doesn't lie. Witness after witness confirmed that the land had always belonged to my family. Then came the moment that changed everything. A county clerk testified that Karen had personally requested access to the digital zoning files weeks before the altered maps were submitted. That was the nail in the coffin. When the judge finally ruled, his words echoed in the courtroom like a hammer striking steel. The court recognized me as the sole legal owner of the disputed 10 acres. Every structure built on that land, every foundation, every fence, every house, was legally mine. Karen sat in stunned silence as the verdict was read. The homeowners looked devastated, realizing their properties now sat on land they didn't own. The judge was clear. I had every right to reclaim the land, demand rent, or even order eviction. But I didn't want to punish innocent families. What I wanted was justice and repayment. So instead of evicting anyone, my attorney and I proposed a solution that shocked everyone. I would lease the land beneath the 9 houses back to the homeowners at a fair monthly rent. That way, they could keep their homes, and I could reclaim what was rightfully mine, both legally and financially. Karen's reputation was destroyed. She was removed as HOA president, fined heavily, and eventually faced criminal charges for document fraud. The HOA board dissolved temporarily under state oversight. As for me, I became an unlikely landlord, collecting monthly rent from 9 houses that, ironically, had been built to push me off my own property. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA had tried to erase me from the map, but in the end, they'd only made me richer. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. She had lost everything, and that made her dangerous. After the court's decision, life on my land finally began to settle, at least on the surface. The storm that had consumed my quiet life seemed to have passed. The legal war was over, the title was restored, and justice, for once, had been served. But beneath that calm, another battle was brewing, one far pettier, nastier, and more personal than the one before. Because if there was one thing I had learned about Karen Holloway, it was that she never accepted defeat. She had lost her presidency, her influence, and her so-called reputation as the queen of the neighborhood. The HOA board had forced her to resign, and the county had slapped her with fines for falsifying documents. Most people would have laid low, maybe even left town. But not Karen. She stayed right where she was, living in one of the very houses she'd built illegally, now standing on land that legally belonged to me. And every month she had to send her rent check to the man she'd tried to destroy. At first, she paid quietly. Her checks came in on time, never late, always exact to the penny. But soon, small signs of rebellion started showing. The first month, her check was made out with my name spelled wrong. Then she started mailing it late, citing postal delays. Later, she switched to paying in cash, hand-delivered in unmarked envelopes, as if it were some sort of humiliation ritual. It wasn't about the money for her. It was about control. She wanted me to know she hadn't truly given up. I tried to ignore her petty games, but Karen wasn't the type to be ignored. She began stirring up trouble within the community, whispering to the other homeowners that I was profiting off their misery. She painted herself as the victim, the woman who lost everything to a greedy land baron. Her gossip spread like wildfire, and soon I started noticing changes in the way the community treated me. People stopped waving when I drove by. The friendly neighbors who used to greet me with smiles now avoided eye contact. My fence line became a magnet for trash and vandalism. Someone even spray-painted "land thief" on one of my old barns. It didn't take long to trace the source of the chaos. Karen had quietly organized a neighborhood committee that wasn't officially part of the HOA but acted like one. Their meetings were filled with grievances about me. They petitioned the county to review my leasing practices, accusing me of extorting residents. They even tried to file a nuisance complaint, claiming my livestock lowered property values. It was absurd, but effective. Their complaints tied up county inspectors, wasting my time with surprise visits and endless paperwork. Every week brought a new letter, a new inspection, a new headache. But the final straw came when one of the homeowners, a young family renting from me, found an anonymous note taped to their door. It warned them not to renew their lease, claiming that the land would soon revert to HOA ownership. The handwriting was familiar, neat, and sharply curved, just like Karen's. That's when I realized she wasn't just trying to annoy me. She was trying to push me out again, this time by turning the neighborhood against me from the inside. So I decided to change tactics. If she wanted a war, I'd fight it with something stronger than anger. I'd use her own obsession with control against her. I began documenting everything, every letter, every inspection, every small act of harassment. I installed cameras near my fence lines and driveways. I kept logs of every rent payment and recorded every interaction with HOA representatives, county inspectors, and neighbors. I wasn't just defending myself anymore, I was building a case. Then, an unexpected opportunity arrived. A local journalist who had covered the original land dispute reached out to me, curious about how things had turned out. I told her the full story, how the HOA had been exposed, how Karen had lost her power, and how she was now attempting to reclaim it through manipulation and lies. When the story went live, it exploded online. The headline was brutal. Disgraced HOA president still harassing victim she tried to defraud. Karen's name became local infamy overnight. The news segment featured clips of her former neighbors, describing how controlling she had been as HOA president, how she fined people for unapproved lawn decorations and even banned Christmas lights that weren't neutral white. The internet tore her apart. Comments poured in, calling her everything from Karen Supreme to the HOA tyrant who lost it all. For a moment, I thought that would finally put an end to her crusade. But humiliation only made her more dangerous. A week after the news broke, I woke up to find my mailbox smashed, tire tracks running through my front ditch, and my gate padlock cut. Nothing was stolen, but it was clear. A message had been sent. I filed a police report, but there wasn't much they could do without proof. Still, I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen was unraveling, desperate to regain some kind of control over the chaos she had created. But fate has a funny way of turning things around. That same month, the county completed its audit of the HOA's finances from Karen's time as president. They found discrepancies, tens of thousands of dollars missing from community improvement funds. The audit revealed that Karen had used HOA money to pay for her personal legal fees and home renovations. The county forwarded the findings to the state attorney's office for criminal review. It was the final nail in her coffin. Within weeks, she was served with charges of embezzlement and fraud. The same county courthouse where she had once strutted around as if she owned the place now became the setting of her downfall. The new HOA board, desperate to distance themselves from her, issued a formal apology to me and the homeowners. Ironically, Karen's arrest stabilized the very community she had poisoned. The neighbors who once saw me as the enemy began apologizing, some even thanking me for standing up to her. The rent checks came on time, the vandalism stopped, and peace finally began to return to my land. For the first time in months, I could walk my property without tension in my chest. The air was quiet again, the fields green, and the sounds of construction replaced by birds and wind. Still, deep down, I knew the story wasn't over. Karen was facing trial, but she wasn't in prison yet. And for someone as prideful and vindictive as her, being caged, even metaphorically, only made her more determined to strike back. The peace I felt was fragile, like the stillness before another storm, and that storm was already gathering on the horizon. The months that followed Karen's arrest were quiet, almost too quiet. After everything that had happened, I should have felt nothing but relief. The land was finally mine again. The legal war was over, and the rent payments from the 9 houses came in like clockwork. The once hostile neighborhood was now calm and compliant. It felt like justice had been done. But deep down, I knew better. Karen Holloway was not the kind of person to go down without a final act of vengeance. And sure enough, that final act was already in motion. Her criminal trial drew local attention again, reopening old wounds in the community. The homeowners who had been under her thumb were subpoenaed as witnesses, forced to recount the lies and financial manipulation she'd pulled off during her reign as HOA president. Every hearing brought her further humiliation, but instead of remorse, Karen doubled down. She accused everyone, me, the HOA board, even the county, of conspiring against her. I tried to stay out of it. I'd given my testimony, presented my records, and wanted nothing more to do with her drama. But then, one day, my attorney called with disturbing news. Karen had filed a civil countersuit from jail. Her claim? That I had unfairly profited from the land dispute by collecting rent on homes that, in her words, would not exist without her vision and effort. It was a ridiculous argument, but it forced another round of hearings. She was representing herself this time. No lawyer wanted to touch her case after what she'd done. Still, she was relentless. She flooded the court with motions, each more absurd than the last. She claimed emotional distress, loss of reputation, even intellectual property rights over the design concept of the houses. The court dismissed each motion one by one, but her persistence clogged the system for months. Then, out of nowhere, something strange started happening on my property. It began with small things: mailboxes knocked over, security cameras tampered with, and tire tracks near the southern fence where the HOA property line began. I assumed it was kids or vandals, but then came the letters. They arrived in plain white envelopes with no return address. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, unmistakably familiar. Each one was filled with rambling threats about reclaiming what's rightfully mine and undoing the theft of my legacy. I took them straight to the police, who added them to Karen's growing list of harassment evidence. But the most chilling part, she was still in county jail awaiting sentencing. That meant someone on the outside was doing her bidding. The police increased patrols, and I tightened security around the property. The neighbors were uneasy, too. Some had seen strange vehicles parked at night near the cul-de-sac, cars that idled for hours with their headlights off. Others reported someone trying to pry open mailboxes. It was clear Karen still had supporters, or at least people willing to act on her behalf. One night I woke to the sound of engines. I looked out from my porch and saw headlights bouncing across the field. A pickup truck and a van were moving toward the cluster of houses, the ones that stood on my land. I grabbed my phone and called the sheriff's office. By the time deputies arrived, the vehicles were gone, but the damage was done. One of the homes, ironically the one Karen used to live in, had been vandalized. Windows shattered, the garage door smashed in, and graffiti sprayed across the walls. The words were hauntingly clear: "You stole everything." It was the last straw for the authorities. They traced the threats, reviewed the jail visitation logs, and discovered that one of Karen's old friends, another former HOA member who had quietly disappeared after her arrest, had been visiting her weekly. That friend had been the one carrying out her orders, delivering letters and organizing the vandalism. The police arrested him within days, and with that, Karen's last attempt to control anything crumbled. The judge fast-tracked her sentencing, and when the verdict came, it was decisive. She was found guilty of embezzlement, fraud, and witness harassment. Her sentence: 5 years in state prison. When the news broke, the neighborhood collectively exhaled. For the first time in what felt like forever, peace wasn't just an illusion. It was real. The HOA board, now led by a much calmer and level-headed president, made it clear that they wanted nothing more to do with Karen or her legacy. They began cooperating fully with the county and me, helping restore clear boundaries, correcting property records, and ensuring no future development could encroach on my land again. Even the homeowners who had once doubted me reached out, offering apologies and small gestures of goodwill. One family brought over fresh-baked bread. Another offered to help repaint my barn after the vandalism. For the first time, there was a real sense of community, one built not on control, but respect. Financially, the resolution worked in my favor more than I could have imagined. The lease agreements I'd established became stable, long-term contracts. Each home contributed steady rent, enough to cover taxes, maintenance, and then some. What had started as a nightmare of betrayal and fraud had turned into a steady source of income that secured my future. But more than the money, it was the principle that mattered. Every check that arrived reminded me that justice had a way of balancing the scales, even if it took time. Sometimes, I'd walk the southern field, the land that had nearly been stolen from me, and look at the row of 9 houses. Each one stood as a strange monument to everything that had happened: arrogance, deceit, perseverance, and eventual victory. Still, I couldn't help but think of Karen. Even from behind bars, I knew she would be stewing in resentment, replaying her downfall over and over. For someone like her, losing control was worse than losing freedom. She had built those houses as her triumph, her legacy, and now, every month, they quietly paid me. There was a dark, poetic justice in that. But just when I thought the chapter had finally closed, something unexpected arrived in the mail one morning. It was a plain, official-looking envelope with the return address of the state correctional facility. Inside was a single piece of paper. No threats this time. No rambling claims. Just one handwritten line, scrawled in that same sharp, deliberate script. Enjoy it while it lasts. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be one. I knew exactly who had written it. I stared at the words for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or worry. Maybe it was just another empty jab from a bitter woman behind bars, or maybe, in her mind, the war still wasn't over. Either way, I wasn't afraid anymore. My land was secure, my name was cleared, and my future was mine again. Whatever Karen had left to throw at me, she'd already lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered to her: power. And that, I realized, was the one thing she could never get back. Months passed since Karen's sentencing, and for the first time in years, I could finally breathe. The noise, the tension, and the chaos that had once surrounded my life were gone. My land was peaceful again, just as it had been before the HOA ever existed next door. The morning sun rose over the same rolling fields my grandparents had once worked, and I could feel their pride in every blade of grass that swayed in the breeze. But though Karen was behind bars, her shadow still lingered. The 9 houses that stood on my land had once been the centerpiece of her empire, a symbol of her control. Now they stood as a reminder of her arrogance and failure. I had legally converted them into long-term rental properties, each under a carefully structured lease. The rent was fair, the contracts clear, and the payments steady. Ironically, what Karen had tried to take from me had become the foundation of my new livelihood. The income allowed me to repair the old farmhouse, rebuild fences, and even invest in upgrades for the tenants. A new playground for the kids, better lighting, and proper landscaping. I wanted the place to feel safe and livable again. Yet, even with Karen gone, the community she'd left behind was fractured. The HOA next door had fallen into disarray after her removal. Without her iron grip, board meetings turned chaotic. Factions formed. Some people wanted stricter rules to restore order, while others demanded freedom from the bureaucracy that had poisoned their neighborhood. Tensions rose again, not with me this time, but among themselves. Rumors spread that a few residents wanted to dissolve the HOA entirely. Others wanted to rebrand it under new leadership, claiming they could rebuild trust and stability. The county, too, was watching closely, ensuring no further corruption could take root. I stayed out of their politics, at least at first. But the more I watched, the more I realized that what happened on their side of the fence could easily spill back into mine if things went wrong. I'd learned that HOAs, once desperate or leaderless, could become unpredictable. Then one afternoon, I got a letter from the newly formed Provisional HOA Board. It was polite, too polite, and congratulated me on my cooperative approach to community rebuilding. But near the end, the tone shifted. They requested a discussion regarding property alignment and shared maintenance obligations. I recognized the coded language immediately. Shared maintenance obligations was HOA speak for money. It was starting again. The new board claimed that my rental properties, though technically outside their jurisdiction, benefited from HOA services such as street cleaning, snow removal, and neighborhood security patrols. They were asking that I voluntarily contribute a monthly maintenance fee, essentially a backdoor way to drag me under their influence again. I refused, of course, politely but firmly. I reminded them that my land was independent, and that the court had already clarified those boundaries. I even cited the exact case number from the lawsuit against Karen. Weeks went by quietly after that, but I could feel eyes on me again. HOA representatives began walking the property lines more frequently. They took photos of my fences, noted where my gravel road connected to the paved cul-de-sac, and even asked my tenants about community compliance. The last thing I wanted was another war, but it was clear that the new HOA wasn't as reformed as they wanted to appear. They were trying to reassert control, slowly and quietly, the same way Karen once had. But there was one key difference this time. I was ready. I'd learned from every trick she pulled. I had detailed records, cameras, and legal counsel on retainer. My property boundaries were not just marked by fences. They were digitally recorded, surveyed, and filed with multiple copies stored securely. If anyone tried to manipulate those lines again, it would be impossible to do unnoticed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that history was repeating itself, just in a more subtle form. The HOA eventually introduced a community enhancement program, funded by new membership fees. Though voluntary at first, residents were heavily pressured to join. They began enforcing soft rules, things like lawn care, recommendations, and architectural advice. It was clear that the same old mindset was creeping back in under new faces. Some of my tenants began receiving letters again, not from Karen this time, but from the new HOA president, a man named Leonard Briggs. His tone was polite but firm, warning them that their property aesthetics might not align with neighborhood guidelines. Of course, the tenants forwarded those letters straight to me. That's when I decided to act before things spiraled out of control. I called a meeting. Not an HOA meeting, but a gathering of everyone living on my land. I explained their rights clearly, reminded them that our properties were not part of the HOA, and assured them that any attempt to enforce rules or fees on my side of the fence would be illegal. I told them to keep records of everything, just like I had years before. That small act of unity changed everything. The tenants, once anxious and isolated, now stood together. They pushed back when the HOA tried to intimidate them. They knew the law was on our side, and more importantly, that I was too. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Other homeowners, tired of the HOA's creeping control, began questioning its purpose again. The same cycle that had once destroyed Karen's reign was starting all over. But this time, I wasn't the target. I was the example. The county, still cautious after the previous scandal, began reviewing HOA complaints more closely. When Leonard tried to file a nuisance report about my tenants' non-compliant mailboxes, the county dismissed it immediately. The judge's ruling from the old case was now considered precedent. My property, and everyone living on it, was legally untouchable by the HOA. That didn't sit well with Leonard. His emails to me grew colder, then more aggressive. He accused me of undermining community harmony and profiting off the HOA's resources. But unlike Karen, Leonard didn't have the same cunning or influence. His arrogance was louder than his strategy. Eventually, the homeowners turned on him too. They voted to dissolve the HOA once and for all, citing mismanagement and corruption fatigue. The community officially transitioned to a non-HOA neighborhood, freeing everyone, including my tenants, from the endless rules and fees. It was poetic. The same organization that had once tried to erase me from my own land had now erased itself. By the time the dust settled, the neighborhood had transformed completely. Without the HOA's interference, people painted their houses the colors they wanted, planted gardens, and even held block parties. For the first time, the area felt like a real community, not a battlefield. And as for me, I watched it all unfold from my porch, content and quiet. My land was thriving again. The 9 houses that had once symbolized theft and deceit were now homes filled with laughter and life. It took years of fighting, courtrooms and sleepless nights, but I had finally achieved what I set out to do, not just to reclaim my property, but to protect it from anyone who would ever try to take it again. Yet even in that peace, I knew one thing for sure. Power always tries to creep back in, one rule at a time. And when it did, I'd be ready. Because once you've gone to war with an HOA and survived, there's nothing left to fear. Years had passed since that stormy chapter of my life. The lawsuits, the harassment, the chaos, and the endless battles against the HOA that had tried to take everything from me. Looking back now, it almost felt like another lifetime. The land that once echoed with the sounds of bulldozers and construction had returned to something far more peaceful, far more meaningful. The sun still rose over those same green fields every morning, casting long golden light across the barns and fences. The air still carried the faint scent of wildflowers after rain, but now, those sights and smells came with a deeper weight. The satisfaction of knowing that my family's legacy had not just survived, but grown stronger through everything it endured. The 9 houses that once stood as monuments to fraud had become homes, real homes, filled with families who respected the land they lived on. Children played in the fields that Karen had once tried to pave over. Porch lights flickered on in the evenings, and laughter carried through the air. The people who lived there weren't just tenants anymore. They were part of something bigger, a quiet community born out of defiance and resilience. For years, the rent payments came in steadily. I had turned that chaos into opportunity, and those 9 houses now funded not just the upkeep of my land, but its preservation. I restored the old farmhouse completely. New siding, reinforced beams, and the same deep green paint my grandparents had chosen decades ago. I built a small workshop, repaired the stables, and even set up a tiny visitor area for local history enthusiasts. My family's name, once nearly erased from the county records, was now part of the town's official heritage registry. It felt poetic. The same land that Karen had tried to steal became the very foundation of my future. But even in peace, I never forgot the lessons those years had taught me. Power attracts greed, and greed never stays buried for long. The HOA next door no longer existed. It had dissolved completely after Leonard's failed attempt to revive its control. The neighborhood that had once prided itself on perfection was now free and thriving. Without the constant surveillance and rules, the homes took on personality. Some painted their walls bright colors. Others built gardens and fences that reflected their individuality. What was once a sterile subdivision had turned into something warm and human again. Ironically, I found myself helping many of those same homeowners who once saw me as their enemy. When the HOA collapsed, they were left without structure or guidance. I offered advice, helped them with county permits, even shared contacts for reliable contractors. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I understood what it was like to lose control over your home, to have someone else decide what your life should look like. Over time, that simple kindness turned into something remarkable. The neighborhood, along with my land, evolved into a self-sustaining cooperative. Not an HOA, but a voluntary community alliance. No fines, no power-hungry presidents, no endless lists of violations. Just neighbors helping neighbors. And somehow they looked to me as the one who had made it possible. It wasn't something I had planned or sought out, but life has a way of coming full circle. The man who once stood alone against a corrupt HOA had become a quiet leader of a community built on fairness and respect. I often smiled at the irony. Still, every so often, I'd think about Karen. Rumors drifted in over the years. Some said she'd served her sentence quietly. Others claimed she'd tried to start over in another town. A smaller HOA, a new identity, the same patterns. I didn't care to find out. In my mind, she'd become less of a person and more of a cautionary tale. A reminder of how easily greed can blind someone to reality. Her downfall had left a mark on this place, one that no one could ever fully erase. People still talked about her when new families moved in. They'd point to the southern road that led into the rental homes and whisper about the HOA president who lost everything. It had become a kind of local legend, one part tragedy, one part justice. Sometimes, when I walked those same roads, I'd catch myself thinking about how different things could have been if I hadn't come back when I did, if I hadn't fought back when she built those houses. If I'd stayed quiet, she might have gotten away with it. The thought always made me pause, because that fight, as exhausting as it was, had defined the rest of my life. It taught me that silence, in the face of corruption, is just another form of surrender, and I would never surrender what my family had built. The years rolled by peacefully. The fields grew thick with grass, and the seasons painted the land in familiar colors: gold in autumn, green in spring, white in winter. I often spent my mornings sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise stretch across the horizon. I'd see the faint outlines of those 9 houses in the distance, their rooftops glinting in the light. It always made me smile, a quiet reminder that even the worst parts of our lives can lead to something good if we fight for what's right. Eventually, I started passing down the lessons to the next generation. My niece, who had always been fascinated by the story, decided to study property law. She wanted to help protect other landowners from facing what I did. I told her every detail, every trick, every setback, every victory. She listened with wide eyes, not because the story was grand, but because it was real. And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about legacy. Not just my family's, but the legacy of standing up for fairness when everyone else turns away. Years later, when I was older and slower, I decided to write everything down. Every document, every letter, every map, all neatly organized into a leather-bound file. I left it in my study, labeled simply, "The HOA War." Not out of bitterness, but so that someday, long after I was gone, anyone who opened it would understand what had really happened and why it mattered. Because stories like mine weren't rare. They were happening in neighborhoods across the country. Small battles between power and principle, control and freedom. But mine had ended differently, not with loss, but with justice. One summer evening, I walked the boundary of my land one last time. The fence that once separated me from chaos, now marking peace. Fireflies danced in the grass, and the sky glowed orange and purple over the hills. I stopped at the southern edge, near the old survey marker that had started it all. It stood there, unchanged and unmoved, a simple post driven deep into the soil. To anyone else it was just wood and metal, but to me, it was everything. Proof that what's right can endure, no matter how hard someone tries to erase it. I looked out toward the houses, their lights flickering softly in the twilight. For the first time in years I felt nothing but gratitude. Karen had tried to steal my land. Instead, she had built my future. And as the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint hum of laughter from those homes, I knew the story had come full circle. The land was still mine. The peace was real, and the legacy, that would last forever.